Okay, we might as well start. My name is Jim Grossman. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending this plenary on erasing history, which is part of the American Historical Association's Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have all of you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. This is an especially timely conversation. Actually, any conversation on history right now is especially timely. Any conversation on history anytime is especially timely. I think yesterday shows us that it's not possible to erase history. It shows us how imperative it is to contextualize everything that's going on around us. It's important, I think, in the wake of yesterday's events, to recognize that such things happen. They are not a moment, that they are somehow not us, that what happened was a product of historical process and is very much us. And this is going to be part of the conversation you're going to hear tonight. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the association, or if you're already a member, by making a small donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat. You can also make a large donation today too. A few very quick logistical issues to cover before we start. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. All participants are muted, all attendees. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but also we'll have to be mindful of the time. The chair will choose which questions to answer and might paraphrase or combine questions. If you would like to be part of the conversation on social media, please remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. I can look at the panel and say that probably about half of the group who are in this room are on Twitter, and we will be happy to engage you afterwards. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording on YouTube as soon as we can. So now it is a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce Professor Annette Gordon-Reed at Harvard University, who is going to chair this panel. And I will disappear so that the panelists can give you the benefit of their wisdom, which is greater than mine.
Thank you, Jim. I thought you were going to disappear.
I'm working on it.
It's my task to introduce the guest tonight. I don't know what's going on here with my video has gone off, but I will. Oh, here I am back again. What would this be without a technical glitch? In any event, it's my task to introduce the panelists and get off as quickly as possible. We're going to start with Daniel Immerwahr, who's an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. He specializes in 20th century US history within a global context. His first book, Thinking Small, was published in 2015, offers a critical account of grassroots development campaigns launched by the United States at home and abroad. His second book, How to Hide an Empire, was published in 2019. And of course, that will have some relevance to what he's going to be talking about tonight, Erasing the American Empire. Laura Matthew is Associate Professor and Director of Latin American and Latinx Studies at Marquette University in Wisconsin. She's a historian of Spanish colonial Mesoamerica, especially in Guatemala. She's a co-editor with Michael Udjik, I don't know if I'm Udjik, which I'm not pronouncing right, I suppose, of Indian Conquistadors, Indigenous Allies in the Conquest of Mesoamerica. That was published in 2007, and the authors of Memories of Conquest, Becoming Mexicano in Colonial Guatemala, published in 2012. She's going to talk to us tonight about erasing Maya heritage in Anglo America. Philip Nord is Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Princeton University, where he's taught since 1981. He's published several books on the history of modern France, including most recently, France 1940, Defending the Republic, published in 2015, and After the Deportation, Memory Battles in Post-War France in 2020. And he's going to talk to us about the erasure of the history of the Holocaust in France in terms of their memorials and the way they remember that event. Finally, we have Shani Roper. Dr. Shani Roper is trained as a social historian with interests in public history and museum education, histories of the Caribbean childhood, and juvenile delinquency. She's the curator of the University of the West Indies Museum. So we will start with Professor Immerwahr.
Great, thanks so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm going to attempt an act of technical proficiency by sharing my screen. Let's see if that works. Boom. Okay, so the theme of this panel is erasing history, and I didn't ask, but I sort of took it that we were against that, that we sought less erased histories or more inclusive histories. And when I was trained as a historian, I think I was implicitly trained on a model for how to do that. And we could name that model demographic thoroughness. So the idea is that within a space, within a frame, within the unit of analysis, we seek to write ampler histories by including more groups and experiences. And I think that that model and understanding of what it is to sort of unerase history is based in the US Academy and has a lot to do with the sort of United States' self-understanding as achieving a more and more perfect union by bringing more people into a political community. And we have a set of metaphors that we use to talk about this, and I'm going to dwell on them for a second because I don't think they're just sort of offhand ways of speaking. I think they sort of structure our understanding of the work that we do. I think that we have a set of metaphors we use, visual pictorial metaphors, and one of them, a really important one, is focus. So I'm just going to sort of in a hammy way actually sort of demonstrate some of these metaphors. So we often think about, there's a sort of field of view, and we're aware that stories that we tell and stories that have been told to us often have unnamed focuses. And sometimes we get really sort of unnerved by them and feel that, preponderance of focus on one area, for example, in this picture, has the effect of erasing other things within the field of view, other people within the field of view, other groups, other experiences, thereby creating, and now I'm kind of shifting metaphors, but this is another metaphor we use, a gap that has to be filled. And we have tools by which we do that. So, even when the archive is sort of not helpful in this way, it encourages one kind of focus. We have ways of reading against the grain, of shifting the focus in an often kind of, that's how we speak of it, onto groups and experiences that have been marginalized as a way of, as a way of what? As a way of restoring what's been erased. And I think all this is done with the implicit goal of having no more blurred regions, right? The idea is that once we've been able to move the focus everywhere, we'll see a fuller picture, and that's what we're aiming for. That's one metaphor. I want to draw your attention now to another metaphor that we sometimes use, but I think has slightly different properties, which has the metaphor of the frame, which refers, sometimes it refers to a methodological approach, but I think it can also refer to our unit of analysis, how we define the parameters of our study. And, one of the ways that we can revise history is not just by changing the focus, but by changing the frame. And I'm not saying anything new. One of the really important contributions of transnational history and the transnational turn has been to recognize that the units of analysis, the frames that we most often use, the ones defined by political borders, can be inadequate, and can be inadequate to studying things like migration, the environment, capitalism, and sometimes we need different kinds of frames. But what I want to suggest to you today is not just that focus is one thing, frame is another, but they kind of operate differently. And to give you a sense of that, I want to just give you an example, a very recent example from my own research. So right now I'm researching 19th century fires, urban fires in the United States, of which there were a lot. And part of what I'm doing is trying to produce a data set that will help me understand where they were, how extensive they were. And so I found myself relying on the fact that people in the 19th century also produced lists of the fires that meant a lot to them. So I find myself confronting pages like the one I'm showing you right now quite a lot, and sort of transcribing them into my own data set. But when I look at a page like this, I do something that I suspect is going to feel familiar to a lot of people in this audience, is that I filter. So looking at a page like this, most of the things on this page will be relevant, but this line here refers to a fire in Montreal, not in the United States. And I have this feeling often of thinking, oh, okay, well, that's not something I need to worry about. That's beyond my purview, despite the fact that Montreal is a bike ride away from the northern border of the United States, and despite the fact that this is the most serious fire on this page, and quite a serious fire at that. We have this experience of just knowing where the outer edge of our study is, and having a sense of not worrying about things that lie beyond that. That's what a frame does. And my purpose here is not to suggest that I personally should care more about Montreal, although that's absolutely true, but just to sort of juice your intuitions about what that feeling is that we have when we define our limits. We're always going to have those limits, but when we define our parameters, we have a way of just feeling that whatever lies beyond them really does lie beyond them. It's beyond the edge of our world. And that's not something that really can be fixed with focus. I think the metaphor here, we can still use metaphors from photography, but the metaphor wouldn't be about focus or gaps in the field of vision or erasures in it, but would be about cropping. In this case, it's kind of showing you the fuller version of this photo, which is a photo of a family, and in this case has 3 parents. Cropping works a little differently. Framing works a little differently than focus. First of all, how you frame a study is an early decision. And it's a kind of hard decision to get around once you've made it. It's easier to adjust the focus of your work than it is to adjust the frame of it. Another difference is that cropping or framing is something that is quite obviously constructed, right? We can argue with the metaphor of erasures of something that's there, or gaps of things that are existing in the world that we'd like to see better. We can imagine that we're getting a view onto a world that exists, and we'd like to see it better. That's getting more objective. But when we're talking about frames, there's no right. It's quite obvious that there's no right frame. There's no wrong frames. These are all choices we make. Another way in which frames, I think, are different from focuses is that they are so strongly reinforced, especially spatial frames, places that we look at, reinforced by the nature of our archives, the location of our archives, the languages that we learn, the structure of our graduate training, the structure of our journals. All these ways kind of tell us what is a proper unit of analysis. And when you want to have a different one, you often find yourself sort of swimming upstream. I had this experience myself when I was seeking to write a book that came out last year about the United States's territorial empires, overseas territorial empire. And as I was doing that, I realized that I was colliding up against a hegemonic spatial frame, one that was hegemonic for me too, that I'd sort of grown up with and had a hard time unthinking, which is this. I think if you ask most people to envision what the United States spatially looks like, the picture that would come to their mind would be this very familiar silhouette. Benedict Anderson called outlines like this logo maps of countries, on the argument that if countries had logos, they would look like that. And he's not entirely wrong about that. And we all know, or those of us who've grown up in the United States are fully aware that these aren't the right borders of the United States. And most maps, although not all of the country, look more like this. And they will show in boxes offset, usually in the Pacific, Alaska, and Hawaii. Of course, if you've been to Alaska, you know some of the great dissatisfaction that there is with maps like this, partly because of how much they shrink Alaska down. I'm going to show you one of my favorite maps that I encountered, which is a map of the United States mapped by, I presume, an Alaskan, or at least mapped from an Alaskan's perspective. So this is all the United States, but not mapped from the lower 48, as Alaskans call it, but from Alaska. There you have it. It has all of the same places that were on the previous map, but here Alaska is rendered in loving cartographic detail, the coastline gotten all right, whereas what Alaskans call the lower 48 is just some sort of distended Gumby-like thing in a little inset. Cartographic revenge. I found that when I was trying to do my research, that I had this vision of the United States in my mind, of course, because that's how I'd learned to think about a country where I'd grown up. And it was pretty hard to unthink that. And I decided that I wanted to remap the country, partly because I had a really hard time finding maps that corresponded to the understanding of the country that I wanted to put across in the book. And so this is a map I made of something that I couldn't find, which is an equal area projection map that shows all of the inhabited parts of the United States to scale. And I picked the year 1940, which is a sort of an apex year for the United States' territorial empire. And that's what it looked like, which is kind of a surprise to me, because when you look at a map like this, you see that the place that we call the United States really isn't the whole of the United States. It's better called what people from overseas territories often call it, the mainland. And once you can sort of see that, you can tell new stories, not as a way of filling gaps, but just, you know, that immediately present themselves within this new field of vision. I'll give you just one quick example. One of the sort of important grounding stories in the national mythology of the United States is the story of the Good War, World War II, which is often narrated in textbooks and documentaries as such, as a war that had interesting features for the United States because, with the exception of the attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the United States wasn't directly attacked. So it was not a war fought on US soil. There was a clear division, as we often tell the story, between the home front and then over there where people fought, where people from the United States fought. And the result being that US civilians had experiences participating in the war as laborers, as consumers, but not as people, direct targets from the war. That's a story that makes no sense once you have this as your map of the United States, because all it takes is a moment with Wikipedia to reveal that all parts of US soil were directly involved in World War II. This is a war that involved attacks on American Samoa, that involved attacks and invasions and occupations of the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and the western tip of Alaska. All of these places are US territories. And if we're talking about how US civilians, people living on US soil, US nationals are impacted, we'd have to then mention the fact that World War II kills more than 1 million civilians on US soil who are US nationals. They have a different relationship to the United States. Many of them are nationals without being citizens, but nevertheless, that's a war experience that doesn't often get told as part of the story. Part of what I tried to do in my book was to just go at a lot of US history and see how it would come out differently once we change the unit of analysis, change the spatial frame. I'm not the only person doing this work, and I've been really encouraged by a lot of exciting work that other historians are doing, where the main engines of their research is to respatialize old stories. So a great book that came out recently is Vincent Brown's Tacky's Revolt. And if you know much about Jamaican history, Tacky's Revolt is so easy to narrate the way the title makes it sound, which is a very strong act of insubordination led by one enslaved man, Tacky, that, you know, just kind of had enough. But what Brown is able to do by starting the story in West Africa is to realize that this is actually part of a much larger Coromantee War that takes place in Africa, takes place in the Caribbean, and gets entangled with the imperial circuits of the 7 Years' War. And we're just looking at one little part of it when we reduce the event to Tacky's revolt. Often respatialization involves, as it does with Brown, a kind of zooming out, but it doesn't have to. It can also involve cropping in more closely. Kenneth Pomerantz's really influential and just terrific book, The Great Divergence, works by zooming in and not looking at economically all of China as a single economic unit, but just looking at the Yangtze River Delta and comparing that to Britain, and suddenly all kinds of new insights tumble out. This isn't just fiddling around with focus. What Pomerantz and Brown are doing is rejecting received geographies. And I think that's such an important act. It's important not just because it pulls new things into view. It's important because dominant geographies has a way of hiding a lot of historical action. A lot of important things that happen are hard to see through the eyes of the dominant geography. And I'll just give a final example of someone who does this really well. Vanessa Ogle, who has this wonderful article in the AHR, Archipelago Capitalism, that's going to become a book, which is a look at recent developments in capitalism, and often that we kind of group under the phrase neoliberalism. But it's a look at it not through financial centers like New York or London. Rather, it's a look at it through the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Malta, places where it turns out a lot of capital accumulates and a lot of capital flows. And once you pay attention to places that seem so peripheral from the dominant geographies, you realize that actually this is the story of the economy, and our narration and our chronology of neoliberalism has got to change. This is a remapping, and in some cases, the remapping isn't just conceptual, it's literal. Brown spent a lot of time working with cartographers on digital humanities projects to actually make maps. And I found that that was really helpful for me as well. Learning how to make maps helped me ask new questions, helped me answer new questions, and also supplied a really nice metaphor for what we do when we focus, when we look not just at focus, but on frame. We are becoming no longer map takers of, takers of received geography, but in our own right, map makers. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that. Laura, Dr. Matthew, take us to another, well, not so far away, but.
Not so far away. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation with so many comparative approaches to the whole question. And yeah, that's interesting, Daniel. We were given a very simple title, Erasing History, and then, to make of it what we wanted to. There's also a sort of fundamental assumption there that something has been erased. So I went looking for what exactly which erasure I was going to talk about. I work in Mesoamerica, so that's a geographical term for a civilizational or a cultural idea. These are the geographical boundaries of specifically indigenous civilizations, anywhere from northern central Mexico going down into Belize, the Yucatan, what's now Guatemala, Honduras, and even as far as the northern Pacific coast of Nicaragua. I work mostly in the Spanish colonial period, and I work mostly in Guatemala, as Annette mentioned. And so this means that the indigenous people that I usually am working and studying about tend to be speakers of Mayan language. People of Mayan descent are still about half of the population officially in Guatemala, and they still speak about 23 to 26 different Mayan languages. And so there's a very live discussion amongst historians in Mexico and Guatemala, where I tend to work the most, about indigenous Mesoamerican history being erased or appropriated by national narratives. But it felt presumptuous for me as a United States historian who, first of all, is very aware of the role that US imperialism played in those countries and in those regions, and also who's very aware of the ways in which the United States has its own version of erasing Mesoamerican history within our own borders. And so I decided that instead of sort of recapping some of the discussions that are going on in some of the places where Mayan descended people and Maya live today, I wanted to talk about the groups known as the Maya, since that's the history that I know best, and their erasure in Anglo America. And when I use the term Anglo America, I'm using it in sort of a double sense, both in the kind of Ben Franklin racializing sense to mean white America, but also following Latin American usage in Spanish, where the term Anglosajona is a little bit less racialized and is differentiating more a kind of political project of British Protestant America in comparison with Iberian, Spanish, and Portuguese Catholic America. So it has a bit more of a religious political tone and a little bit less of a racist tone. When I started thinking about this question, I found myself with this phrase that kept coming back to me, that the Maya in Anglo America are sort of hidden in plain sight. And this is not quite the same as the changing of the frame that Daniel, I think you were talking about, which I think implies that outside of the frame, certain peoples or histories or geographies are just systematically and persistently ignored, right? They're not seen because they're outside of the frame. Most people in the United States, I would wager and bet, have heard of the Maya, right? And they might have even have some historical ideas about the Maya. So the Maya are there, they're inside the frame. But when I was thinking about it, what struck me is that I think that the historical ways that that Anglo America remembers the Maya, they happen in fragments of history that are very rarely woven together into a kind of cohesive narrative of change and continuity over the long term. So as a result, the living Maya, the people who are Maya today, whether they're in Central America or in North America, become kind of stock characters in this series of episodic dramas with no through line that connects their past or present at all. And I was reminded of this. I was lucky enough, I guess this is one of the benefits of living in Zoomlandia now during the pandemic. I was able to attend Harvard University's Edward Matos Moctezuma commemorative lecture this year, in which they featured last November the Mexican writer Juan Villoro. And he was quoting from a book that he wrote in 1989. It was a travel log about the Yucatan, which is primarily Maya, a series of states in southern Mexico, southeastern Mexico. And he wrote that in the state capital of the state of Yucatan, which is Mérida, in Mérida, the Maya, quote, "The Maya are not spoken of in the present tense. You can think anything about the Maya except that they are alive." And that was the end of the quote from the book. But then he added something that's not in the book that I just thought was extraordinarily beautiful. He said the Maya are thought of as extratemporal beings, and that it was that, paradoxically, which can render them invisible. And so I decided I wanted to play with the same idea of extratemporality of the Maya in Anglo America. And I have three main ideas that I think most Americans, or maybe not, they may not remember all three of these historical fragments of Maya history, but they're the three that I think are the most common. I think the most prominent historical idea that Anglo America tends to have of the Maya is very similar to Villora's Mérida, which is the ancient Maya of long ago. And this makes complete sense because the United States has played a very outsized and important role in the development of Mayanist archaeology ever since John Lloyd Stevens, who was from New Jersey. He had asthma and he went traveling first in the Middle and East and North Africa. And then he went and he traveled along the Ruta Maya with his British traveling companion, Frederick Catherwood, in the middle of the 19th century and produced these very beautiful and romanticized accounts of finding and being guided to, because he in fact was guided to, ruins of old ancient Mayan cities, and they were doing rubbings of hieroglyphs and so on. And this inspired generations of US anthropologists and archaeologists in the United States and internationally as well. And this was really a very international movement that included many Europeans as well. The Peabody Museum of Harvard started surveying Mayan sites, in 1892. The Carnegie Institute of Washington between 1913 and 1955 spent almost $3 million funding hundreds of excavations all through Maya land in Mexico, in Chiapas, in the Yucatan, in Quintana Roo, in Guatemala, and what's now Belize. They had international teams of researchers from this laundry list, right, of very eminent universities in the United States, not only Harvard, but Cornell, Chicago, Duke, Tulane, the state universities of Michigan, of California, the US Geological Survey, the United Fruit Company, right, famously, so some private entities there as well. And then after World War II, when the Carnegie Institute withdrew their funding, they sort of shut down that part of their program. Institutions, very importantly, like the Smithsonian, the Field Museum in Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, and of course, the National Geographic Society continued, right, funding and doing this very important work. So even now, my students, may have stumbled upon some kind of PBS or some other YouTube video that's talking about the latest discoveries or the breaking the code of the Maya glyphs, or most recently, looking at the true extent of some of these ancient cities using LiDAR technology, and that gets them very, very excited. The success of this kind of archaeological study, and it really is an amazing story, helped to buttress a second, I think, more insidious set of ideas about the Maya, not only in Anglo America, and that is that they collapsed or they disappeared. This is almost always in reference to the lowland Mayan cities in the 9th and the 10th century that, for a variety of reasons, including some very severe climatic changes and droughts, were abandoned. And it's very ironic to me now in the time of COVID that it usually doesn't reference what was truly almost a devastating collapse of the Maya, various Maya populations and other indigenous peoples in the 16th century, in which an average of about 80% of the population died off because of pandemic disease over the course of only 100 years. Regardless, there's a connection in this idea of collapse to a kind of more subtle formulation, which is also something you see very commonly in Mexico and in Guatemala in the 19th century in nation building, which is that the living Maya are just remnants, remnant populations of once great civilizations. And this idea was also kind of unwittingly reinforced, I think, by the anti-racist, more indigenous anthropology of Franz Boas at Columbia University in the early 20th century, after which followed a whole series of US anthropologists that went to Guatemala in the first half of the 20th century that I was reading in graduate school: Robert Redfield, Ruth Bunzel, Maud Oakes, Eric Wolf, who later wrote Europe and the People Without History, and so on. And because of these anthropologists' work, there was a cementing, I think, of a vision of the Maya as a rural peasant society. That is a society that, in the economic language of the middle of the 20th century, was underdeveloped, almost necessarily because of their isolation that had allowed them, in fact, to maintain their culture. This was the formulation. As Villoro noted for the Yucatan, and here I'm going to quote again from his book from 1989, that which is outside of the city, the green, the jungle, the sisal agave plants, is the world of the peasants, the Indians, the others. I find Villoro's use of the term Indian here very important, and I think it signals to us an overlap between Latin American and Anglo-American racism towards the Maya and other indigenous peoples. The Maya's Indianness, marked by colorful dress and mysterious languages and exotic customs, is very attractive to US tourists and is sold to them, and was sold to them, and is continued to be sold to them today by national tourism boards. But in both Mexico and in Guatemala and in El Salvador, we could go on, and in the United States, Indian, that term Indian, has also been a racist term indicating brown skin, poverty, disease, a lack of education, and a certain amount of kind of unrepentant paganism. In Anglo America, The two terms Indian and Mexican specifically have sometimes functioned as synonyms. I grew up with this in Texas. And they merge into what Kelly Lytle Hernandez has called Mexican brown, a type of person identifiable, especially by law enforcement, by a combination of skin color, national origin, and certain class and ethnic markers like wearing huaraches, which are a certain kind of sandal, or not being able to speak Spanish very well. So I want to come back to that point about Mexican brown a little bit later. And the third and final historical fragment of the Maya that I think tends to be remembered in Anglo America much more recently now is the Maya's victims, and victims specifically of Guatemala's genocidal civil war from 1960 to 1996. This is something that has its start, will very often be traced back to a 1954 CIA-sponsored coup that overthrew the Guatemalan president, and then really ramped up in the late 1970s and the 1980s. And at the time when the violence was reaching its peak, this is of course also the time of Iran-Contra in Nicaragua and the war in El Salvador. The US press at the time wrote far less about what was happening in Guatemala and the atrocities there than it wrote about El Salvador and Nicaragua. Then as the Cold War receded, Central America got sort of overshadowed by NAFTA and ever accelerating Mexican immigration, and then 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan. And by the mid 2000s, and I'd be interested to know if other people have had this experience, I found that my students' awareness of Central America, which had, when I was in college, been a place that most people at least recognized as having some geopolitical and moral importance for the United States, had just completely fallen off their mental maps. It was really quite striking, the difference. Things shifted again in the 2010s, but this time, unlike in the 1980s, Guatemala and the Maya seemed to get all the attention. A series of dramatic human rights trials in Guatemala made for compelling storytelling. The gruesome details of the war, the dogged determination of the prosecutors and their allies, and the innocence of their victims, and I think their indigeneity here was a big part of that, spawned mainstream investigative reporting that attracted media star power like Ira Glass and Steven Spielberg. And most recently, if you're on HBO, you can look at George Clooney's production of the Jewish American Guatemalan writer Francisco Goldman's book, The Art of Political Murder. All of this brings me back to Villoro and his idea of the Maya as extratemporal beings, and also to Lytle Hernandez's Mexican brown. I think today the most common way that Anglo America sees the Maya, not as a historical fragment, but just sees them, is as immigrants. While Mexican immigration to the United States has dramatically declined since the 2000s, migration from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras has steadily increased. And so I asked myself, does Anglo-American awareness of the ancient Maya, or their curiosity about contemporary Mayan Indian cultures, or the sympathy for the Guatemalan Mayas victims of genocide, give the Maya any advantages as immigrants in the United States? The evidence, I think, would suggest not. Guatemalans, most of the Maya, have been separated from their children and deported without them at higher rates, for example, than El Salvadorans and Hondurans in 2018 and 19. And the Hondurans and the El Salvadorans are more likely to speak Spanish, and I think that's part of the reason. On the other hand, the indigeneity of El Salvadorans and Hondurans is routinely made invisible by their lack of some of the external markers of Indianness, and by Anglo-American ignorance that they too belong to Mesoamerica. The past falls away and everybody becomes Mexican brown. This, for me, is an erasure by selective remembering and forgetting. Would it make a difference if we connected the dots? Much to their credit, those who have had the most success in popularizing historical knowledge of the Maya, which I would say are the archaeologists, the sort of two extremes, the archaeologists at the early point and the human rights activists at the most recent point. They've, I think, had the most success in drawing these sorts of lines through history. But the through line that they draw from the Spanish conquest in 1500 to the Civil War in the 1980s is usually very, very compressed. They just sort of skip from maybe 1600 to 1954, and everything in the middle is just glossed over. I am not very confident that we as historians filling in the gaps, as Daniel said, would make much of a difference against the fragmenting Maya history in Anglo America, given persistent prejudices against Lo Indio and a propensity to forget inconvenient or unflattering truths. Witness all the references yesterday to banana republics, a term that originally alluded not to some inherent unself-governability, but to US neocolonialism in Honduras, home of the great Maya city of Copan that John Lloyd Stevens visited in 1839. But there is one group for whom I hold out hope that are striving for a richer, more connected narrative of Maya, Mesoamerican, and indigenous history matters a lot, and that's our students. Because now they're children of Maya immigrants who are growing up in Anglo America. There are other students of indigenous descent, and here I think let's change the frame, right? And we're also talking about indigenous people throughout the Americas, and their non-indigenous classmates alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And now on to Philip.
Great.
Excuse me, Professor Nord.
Philip, it's fine. I hope everything is functioning as it should. You'll signal to me if it's not. Okay. Let me open with a word of thanks to Mary Lindman, who invited me to participate. I don't know if she invited everybody else, but it's a pleasure to be here with you. And also to thank Annette Gordon-Reed for her kind introduction. I don't want it to be bait and switch. It's not quite an erasure that I'll be talking about, but you'll see what my propos is in just a moment. Well, the subject is the Auschwitz Memorial at Père-Lachaise Cemetery. And let me show you a picture of it. There it is. Père-Lachaise Cemetery is located in the northeastern corner of Paris. This monument was erected there in 1949, and it is known as the Auschwitz Memorial. We'll take a closer look, and this moving in and out that I'm going to do, I think picks up a little bit of the thread of framing that's already been discussed by the two previous panels. Well, you'll notice, first of all, the stones that are laid on the monument. And those of you who know about such things will know that this is customary Jewish funerary practice to lay a stone on a tomb. And then as you draw closer, you see this plaque, which I will translate for you roughly. 1941, 1945, Auschwitz, Buchewnald, Nazi extermination camp. Victims of the anti-Semitic persecutions of the German occupier and of the collaborationist government of Vichy, 76,000 Jews of France, men, women, and children, were deported to Auschwitz, most perished in the gas chambers. Victims of police repression, 3,000 resistants and patriots knew suffering and death at Auschwitz. Well, I don't know how you read the monument just at this quick glance, but it has the look of a Holocaust memorial, and it's a first impression that's confirmed as you back away and start to look at the memorial neighborhood, because there's a whole ensemble of memorials concentrated in this little corner. In 1955, a second monument was erected at Père-Lachaise to Ravensbrück, a pair of bound hands emerging from flames. And then some years later, a Mauthausen memorial representing a man carrying stones as prisoners were made to carry stones from the quarry at Mauthausen up a flight of stairs. And I'll show you the fourth in order here. It is the Buchewnald-Dora monument, all at Père-Lachaise, all within about 50 yards of each other. This one unveiled in 1964, representing three prisoners, skeletal figures, one erect, one falling and held up by a comrade. Well, these are all named after Nazi concentration camps. And so what we seem to have before us is an impressive memorial ensemble that evokes the anguish of the concentration camp experience of bodies in pain, in a word, of the Holocaust. Well, you'll notice in this photo taken in wintertime, there are many flowers, but I returned in summertime and there were no flowers. And you can see this inscription. Actually, you can't see it. It's a terrible photo, but there is a conscription underneath the place where those pots of flowers were located. Now, and I'll read you the translation. May this forever show how man is liable to fall and how courage and devotion preserve for him the name of man. And it's signed Aragon. Leave to make what you will of that, but there's also an inscription on the side of the Mauthausen memorial. This one unsigned, and it translates roughly as follows: 180,000 men and women were imprisoned there. 59,000 died, tortured, gassed, shot, hanged. May their sacrifice help to bar the way to oppression and open humanity's path toward a better future of friendship and peace among peoples. Remember, a very small inscription on the Ravensbrück Memorial. Here lie the ashes of women deportees, martyrs of Nazi barbarism, 1939 to 1945. And one more inscription. Yes, we're back at the Auschwitz Memorial, and you step a little further away and you just don't focus on the plaque so much, but shift your focus, as Daniel has encouraged us to do, and you can see some French writing. It's a couplet signed Paul Éluard, and the couplet reads, "When there's killing no more, they will be avenged. Justice's sole wish has as its echo life." So the inscriptions in their own way tell a story of deportees who've been martyred by Nazi barbarism, who in the face of unspeakable cruelty stood together, retained their humanity, and through their sacrifice paved the way for a better future of peace and brotherhood. Well, we've zoomed in. Now I'm going to ask you to step back a little bit. Right next door to this monument is this one, to the heroes and martyrs of the resistance, executed by the Nazis at Châteaubriant, a memorial to the heroes and martyrs of Châteaubriant. The Nazis took 27 prisoners, shipped them to the sand quarries at Châteaubriant in provincial France, and executed them. They did this in reprisal for the assassination of a Nazi officer in Paris at the Barbès-Rochoir metro station. You can visit it today. There used to be a plaque to this assassination there. It's been redone, so I haven't seen it since it's been redone. And among the martyrs who were executed was a young boy whose name you can just see there, Guy Moquet. Some of you will know the name of Guy Moquet, or maybe not, as the case may be. He's remembered, in particular, amongst all these martyrs, because of his youth. He was a teenager at the time that he was executed, and also for a letter he wrote home to his parents, to his mother, and to his father, explaining to them why he was happy to lay down his life. Tell you now, as some of you know, there's a metro stop named after Guy Moquet. He was also a communist. Well, right next to the Buchewnald-Dora monument, and you can see it there just on the right of your screen, is this memorial. It is erected by the Federation of Internees and Deportees Résistants et Patriotes. It's an organizational minority, an organizational memorial. And you look a little closer, the top two names, Colonel Manez and Marcel Paul. Well, who were these men? Marcel Paul was a very senior communist official, and Colonel Manez was a fellow traveler, both of them deportees at Buchenwald, both active in organizing on the French side a prisoners' revolt at the Buchenwald concentration camp in 1945 at the time of its liberation. And now for a wider shot of the Ravensbrück Memorial, which you can see in the back. And there on the left is a very, very interesting memorial, one of the very first erected in this corner of Père-Lachaise Cemetery, erected in honor and in memory of the Brigade Fabien. Who is Fabien? That's his nom de guerre. His real name is Pierre Georges, and he was the commander of the Barbès-Rochechouart operation that killed the German soldier that led to the massacre of hostages at Châteaubriant. He then went on to fight in the liberation of Paris, and he died fighting on the Alsatian front in uniform for the liberation of France. And this memorial was erected to him and several of his comrades. One more feature about Colonel Fabien is he fought in the Spanish Civil War. And it turns out that there are Spanish Civil War monuments in this corner of Père-Lachaise. If you look at the Fabien Memorial, that's the one on the far left, and you move two over, this is the one that you've got. A memorial to the French volunteers of the International Brigades, Spain, 1936 to 1939. I only wish you could see the banners that are on the flowers there. That would be quite expressive in itself. I can tell you what I think I remember them saying, but I'll hold off for just a moment. So there's a Spanish Civil War one, and just to go few down, there's another one. This one has an inscription on it to the memory of all Spaniards who died for liberty. Take a note of the clenched fist, and as happenstance would have it, when I took this photo, there is the Spanish Republican flag hanging off of the memorial, and those are the colors. Well, I don't know if this corner of the Père-Lachaise starts to look a little different. It looks more and more like the patch of earth. It was, at least at one time, if not today, consecrated not so much to Holocaust memory, but as to the memory of the communist resistance. Well, I have three last pieces of evidence: communist resistance during World War II, to cite in this connection. Return to the two poets, Aragon and Paul Éluard. Both were Communist Party members. That's why I suspect you might have known it. And sure enough, Paul Éluard is buried here too. There's his tomb on the right, died in the early 50s. And a little bit later, Maurice Thorez died and was buried next to him. Who was Maurice Thorez? He was the Secretary General of the French Communist Party from 1930 to 1964. Second piece of evidence in this connection: turn on your heels, 180 degrees, and right behind you is this. I don't think you could make out the inscription on that. It's to the dead of the Commune, May 1871. So Paris in 1871 had an insurrection, the Revolutionary Commune. The insurrection ended here at this wall, so-called the Wall of the Federals, when 100+ communards were put up against the wall and executed. These dead are remembered by France's, actually not just France's. You go there, and local Chinese and Vietnamese dignitaries will have left memorial wreaths of one kind or another. It's sacred to the memory of the left of all kinds, communist, socialist, what have you, but of the Communist Party in particular, and that's why the party wants to be in this corner. And one final thing, back to the Auschwitz Memorial. Now you can see right next to it the Châteaubriant Memorial. That's clearly evident. And I'm going to take you back to June 1953, when there was a demonstration at this memorial. And Marcel Paul spoke. He's one of the people honored at the FNDIRP Memorial, the Federation of Deportees and Résistants Memorial, a Communist Party official. And in the crowd were two prisoners, former deportees, wearing the striped uniforms that they had worn in concentration camp days. And they carried aloft, remember it's June of 1953, the photos of this couple, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. These images were sketched by Picasso, who at that time was a Communist Party member himself. The sketches were reproduced in the party newspaper, L'Humanité, in 1954, and here they are. It's not that these were the images that were shown in 1953, photos instead. What this gesture does is that it implicates this memorial in the memory of Auschwitz into a larger worldwide struggle, that of communism against fascism's heir in the Cold War era. From the French Communist Party's point of view, that heir was the United States of America. So it starts off looking like it's a Holocaust memorial, and that's what the guidebooks tell you today that it is. But that's not what it was when it started. It was erected by communists in memory of fellow deportees who've been sent there for resistance activities. How did this change happen? Well, some of it is simple. That plaque that I showed you down there was added in 1995, and just adding it changes the way people look at things. You change a detail in the frame, and the picture takes on a different meaning altogether. But I would just suggest something else, and it may be a point worthy of discussion. I think people come with different, would you put it, glasses on when they look at these, different lenses through which they look. Now they come looking, expecting Holocaust memorials, and they think they see it. They're aided in that by the stones and by the new plaque, but they're anticipating something. And so the lens that they bring enables them to see something, and it also enables them not to see something. So just three concluding points. I don't know if I've taken up too much time yet. The first one has to do with, not with erasure, but with the writing over. Quite literally, in the case of adding a plaque, there is a set of memories that have been layered over by a new set. The word that's used for this is palimpsest, and it's been used in this connection by a historian, French studies, named Max Silverman, and so I'm borrowing from him. Second point I would make has to do with the way in which memorials like this in 1953, but at other moments, are implicated in larger narratives, in the narrative of the struggle against fascism's heirs in the aftermath of World War II. And then the last point, and it's the one to me that seems to be the major takeaway, is that when you look at a memorial, what you see is shaped in part by the expectations you bring to it. And these are expectations that enable you to see and to understand, but also enable you not to see certain things. I wish I had a nice little thank you, as one of the preceders did, my preceders did, but that's where I'll end. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Okay.
And now, Dr. Roper, Shani.
Forgive me, I forgot I was muted. So good night, everyone. It's an honor to be a part of this discussion on erased histories. And the title of my presentation is The De-radicalization of Black Radical Traditions in Jamaica. But I'm really taking this discussion from a public history perspective, as well as using the order of national hero to think about the ways in which the construction of independence diminishes the radical traditions in favor of a colonial aesthetic of the civilized state. And this is exceptionally clear in the classroom. However, before we begin, I'm going to provide some basic information. And so who are the national heroes of Jamaica? Jamaica has 6 national heroes and 1 heroine. So we have Nanny of the Maroons. She's it's really the Right Excellent Grande Nanny of the Maroons. And she was an enslaved African who became leader of the Windward Maroons and basically delayed the expansion of plantations in Jamaica for over the course of 50 years. Once the British assumed control of Jamaica in 1655. The second is Right Excellent Samuel Sharp, and they're not in this case, they're in chronological order. They're not in the date of the order in which they became order national heroes. But Samuel Sharp was the leader of what we also call the Christmas Rebellion. So an anniversary would have been just here, December. And basically the Christmas Rebellion, which takes place in 1831 to 1832, becomes one of the major forces in the dismantling of the Sugar Society. So it helps to propel the Emancipation Act. And it's one of Gillian Matthews, her text subliminal, speaks about 3 major enslaved rebellions that take place in Barbados, British Guyana, and Jamaica that help to show that the plantation economy is actually not working and slavery itself as an institution is not sustainable. Then we have Right Excellent George William Gordon and Right Excellent Paul Bogle, both of whom are part of what we call in Jamaican history, in the timeline of Jamaican history, the Morant Bay War. It takes place in 1865, and so it's long after, about almost 30 years after emancipation, which comes in 1838. And it was put down in a very aggressive manner. And they executed over 600 persons from the parish of St. Thomas in the East. The 5th is Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who is the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and is most well known for the expansion of the association in the US. But he initially founded it in Jamaica in 1914. And he's seen as the leader of one of the largest Pan-Africanist movements. And then the last 2, the Right Excellent Sir Alexander Bustamante and the Right Excellent Norman Washington Manley, are cousins. And they are basically the 2 men that, so Norman Manley is the person who does the initial negotiations for independence coming out of Federation. So this, we're talking about the late 50s, 1960s, which is a lot of Caribbean history. And so Alexander Bustamante becomes the first Prime Minister of Jamaica. They are both the founding fathers of the 2 major political parties that exist in Jamaica and that are still highly functioning. They're really only 2. And most importantly, Sir Alexander Bustamante is the only national hero who receives the Order of National Hero while he's alive. So this is a very, as you can see, each of these persons are considered key in the development of evolution of Jamaica society from the point at which British colonial rule begins. So we don't have any for Spanish colonial rule, but the point at which British colonial rule begins and the point at which Jamaica becomes an independent state. So this is a very important, as you can see, each of these persons are kind of grounded in uprising and resistance to injustice, social oppression. And so we have a National Heroes Park. So there are monuments to all of the national heroes. It's also a site in which the national icons are also buried. So major musical persons, we're thinking about major cultural icons like Louise Bennett Coverley and so on. So they're all buried in this spot. But we've had no new national heroes since the mid-1970s. So this is a monument to the Right Excellent Paul Bogle and the Right Excellent George William Gordon. This is the monument to Nanny of the Maroons, and they're all kind of artistic monuments. This is the monument to Sir Alexander Bustamante and his wife, Lady Bustamante. This is a monument to the Right Excellent Samuel Sharp. Now, for additional context, the Order of National Heroes comes about to replace the British National Honors, right? So on Thursday, August 1, 1968, the Daily Gleaner headline reads, Parliamentary Committee makes recommendation on awards for Jamaican honors to replace British honors with the Order of National Heroes at the top of the list. And it's declared that the Order of National Hero is only to be given in the most exceptional cases and only to national leaders who can be recognized as national heroes. And so the announcement coincides with removal of the royal birthday from the official calendar and the designation of the third Monday in October as National Heroes Day. Marcus Garvey, Paul Bogle, and George William Gordon received the posthumous rewards. And the Political Reporter, a column in the Daily Gleaner, stated that the Order of National Hero and the Jamaica Honorary Rewards System was an independence gift of the greatest importance, which Parliament has produced for the people of Jamaica. It is another step in the right direction to the creation of national awareness. And by 1969, July of 1969, the awards bill was tabled, and it declared Paul Bogle, George William Gordon, Marcus Garvey as the first national heroes. And both Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley were then awarded. Now, this is it was highly celebrated, but then we have to kind of look at what's happening at the same time when they're establishing the Order of National Hero. So for those persons who are familiar with Walter Rodney, what we actually have coinciding at the moment is that in October, while they're doing this initial debate, scholar, activist, and Black nationalist writer, Walter Rodney, was expelled from Jamaica. He was teaching here at the University of the West Indies. And in response, there was a student protest, actually larger than a student protest, really, against his expulsion from the country. And he was also fired from the University of the West Indies. And when the incident occurred, Norman Gervon, who is a scholar, an important scholar in on Jamaican's independence, they wrote that the rapid mobilization of the university student body led to what is now known, of course, as the Walter Rodney riots. And prior to 1968, so just to clarify, independence is 1962. So this is not the British colonial state operating. This is the Jamaican, the newly crafted Jamaican independent government. The Jamaican state had moved aggressively against the Rastafari community in what is now known as the Coral Gardens Massacre or Bad Friday. So that is in 1963, and Professor Deborah Thomas has a film called Bad Friday that includes the accounts of some of the surviving persons from that moment. So within this history of the colonial and post-colonial construction of a nationalist state, what we have is a policing of the Black radical tradition. And within this context, what really do orders of national heroes mean? And this is not necessarily a focus on the monuments, but thinking about the symbolism of the values of nationhood and what these values are supposed to translate to over the course of a developing state, of a state that is evolving. And so a lot of scholars have argued, a lot of scholars have argued that the Order of National Hero is actually integral to the project of cultural transformation. And in this case, it's a cultural transformation of the British Jamaican colonial state into a Jamaican independent population. So they're moving from colonial citizens to Jamaican citizens. And there are four kind of perspectives that challenge it. And a lot of these scholars, of course, are University of the West Indies scholars, but they're also thinking about independence in the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s and when we have the introduction of democratic socialism and the US government withdraws aid from the Jamaican state and plunges the island in a kind of economic depression and scarcity. And a lot of the scholars are reworking or rethinking what is actually the disappointment about independence and the ways in which who is involved in the process of constructing national identity actually removes the values that would inherently undermine a capitalist kind of government and a kind of individualistic approach to governing. And a lot of that is actually hidden in the Black radical traditions that are associated with the national heroes, with the exception of Alexander Bustamante and Norma Manley. So when they were putting together the Order of National Hero and the celebration of the Morant Bay Rebellion, which is the 1865 rebellion, the 100th anniversary, they had actually put a monument of Paul Bogle in the square in the parish of St. Thomas in Morant Bay, the parish capital. And in 1965, October 13, the Donald Sangster, who was the prime minister of the time, said that the lesson to be learned from Morant Bay is that the same objective, which is independence and political freedom, in these days can be achieved by peaceful means. The MP for the constituency stressed that the national heroes focuses attention of the present generation on the noble deeds of the past. And he celebrated the determination of the government to pay tribute. They then go on further to say, I do not wish, however, that it should be construed by some people to mean that the government and others are verifying or celebrating revolution, but we do feel it's important to acknowledge that it exists. So the whole notion of the fight for political freedom and so on, because it required to kind of go into what were some of the key factors that led to each of these uprisings. But the reality is that the construction of the Jamaican state is less about this radical way of being, but rather about negotiation and a kind of civilized way of approaching it. And even with the repatriation of Marcus Garvey's body, and I just want to say that all of these national heroes, with the exception of Norma Manley and Alexander Bustamante, have criminal records. And the Order of National Hero did not lead to the expunging of their records or the records of their followers, right? So a lot of it is that it's very symbolistic and it's a symbolism and it's very tokenistic, but it's not really about fundamentally altering the course of a way you might function or celebrating or thinking in a kind of clear way about Black radicalism. And so it places our long history of fighting, so from the invasion by Christopher Columbus in the 1490s to the granting of independence, that independence becomes a pinnacle of achievement rather than the radical leadings that brought us to that point. So to come back to scholars like Louis Lindsay, Rex Netterford, Trevor Monroe, Brian Meek, and more recently, Maziki Tame, they have argued. So Louis Lindsay in The Myth of Independence argues that independence itself is a myth because constitutional independence doesn't equal economic independence. And the symbols are about manipulation. Similarly, Rex Netterford argues that the construction of Jamaicans' national identity privileges one type of Blackness, which is has more to do with the kind of class colonial elements that linger in the society. And it leads to a kind of romanticism of the Black peasantry, but it sidelines the Black radical tradition. And to kind of explain what that means. So for example, there's a kind of notion that when we have independence and emancipation celebrations, the things that come out are objects that are associated with the Jamaican peasantry, which is your pewter, cutlery, a tilly lamp, different kind of objects. But when if we think about Rastafari, or if we think about Bedouinism, which are more radical traditions, they're not very often celebrated when we do the national celebrations of emancipation and independence. And Maziki Thaim argues that the ambivalence that is experienced in the construction of Jamaica's national identity, more specifically around our relationship with Blackness and how Blackness is defined and engaged, that has a lot to do with the idea of a brown nationalism. That is a political project that promotes Jamaica as a mixed brown nation that distances its development from Blackness. So to kind of explain what this means, Jamaica has a motto that says, out of many, one people. And the notion of the motto is that Jamaica is a diverse society, catering, having Indians, Chinese, Syrians, Lebanese, a wide range of ethnic identities. But in reality, Jamaica's population is something like 96% of African descent. So to say that have a motto that says out of many, one people is actually misleading about which cultural identities get celebrated and which don't. And people are generally less accepting. Now, this I know stands in contrast to how Jamaica is very often perceived as a very radical Black space with Rastafari, with our political leaders engaged in the fight against apartheid, the emergence of Black radical writers, but the reality is that the two traditions actually coexist. And what has happened is the more colonial, less confrontational identity becomes tied into how everyday society functions in Jamaica. And so I end with a recent poll that took place in December last year from the Ministry of Culture, that where over 60% of the participants argued for a merging of Emancipation Day and Independence Day. To explain this, Emancipation Day is August 1. It's celebrated every year, August 1, and Independence Day is August 6th. What happens in Jamaica is that both days are public holidays. And so people will take their entire vacation for the period, or you may not, it just depends. But a lot of people, it's normally a time where you go out, you enjoy cultural events, the government puts on an entire thing. So they argue that in essence, quite a few of the people in the poll said that, they're basically the same thing, let's just merge them and have independence. Now, this is actually, a lot of people came out against it, namely former Prime Minister, oh, my brain just went, P.J. Patterson. And he was part of he had under his leadership, there was a committee that changed the meaning of the flag in the Jamaican flag, but also putting back the separation of Emancipation Day and Independence Day. But Emancipation Day is important because Emancipation Day is part of the legacy of the Black radical tradition. The uprisings against slavery, it's memorialized throughout the post-emancipation period up to 100 years after. And so to merge them, it actually continues to be the kind of centering of independence over over other identities, more specifically the Black radical tradition. So in summary, my presentation and my own interests are about rethinking how we engage the national heroes, and also how we begin changing the approach of the public in response to these histories, a lot of which are histories of trauma, and to then change exactly how teachers are also engaging this topic in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It was fascinating as you were talking. I could only think about my area of study, the early American Republic, and how after the revolution was accomplished, anytime there were rebellions by people who said, hey, the Whiskey Rebellion, we're supposed to be able to go against the government when we want to, and Washington and Hamilton put that down pretty quickly. Once you get in power, then all of a sudden, radicalism, everything changes, and everybody has to play nice. We're going to go to questions in a while, but I did have a question myself as I was listening to these presentations, and any of you can answer, or all of you can answer. What difference does intent make here? Erasure, you don't erase things. Sometimes you can erase things accidentally, but when you think of the erasure, what came to my mind was something deliberate that people were trying to, and I think in your presentation, Shani, you suggest that this is it's a conscious thing that people are doing here to favor one form of one expression or one commemoration over other type of commemoration. But what about, does it matter for historians looking at this if you determine that these are intentional actions on people's parts, or just, you have to have some kind of frame, you have to have some kind of focus in order to write a book, to do something. You can't write everything. You can't put everything in. And so you're always making choices about it. What does intent come in here? Is that something to think about? Or did you think about that when you're doing your work?
I'll go first.
Okay.
For me, I actually think it's intentional. And I think intent does matter, because it actually shapes what, in the case of this specific presentation, what tools are used to achieve the means to the end, right? I mean, art is a very powerful tool of propaganda, right? And so if you are trying to, in this case, build a national identity, but build a national identity that, for example, doesn't make you look like Haiti, right? Because Jamaica and Haiti are very close, and there's an intertwined history there. And if you think about how the region reacted to Haiti as the first independent Black state, then there's a kind of way in which the Jamaican government, the independence government, was very deliberate about what identity is most important. So any identity that challenged what they wanted or they expected, they actually moved ahead very aggressively, which included like the banning of books during that period. So I think intent matters, and intent actually opens the door for some perspectives about how things are done. That's not to say that in some cases there isn't any, but yeah.
And before the rest of you answer, just remind people that you should get your questions ready and put them in the Q&A so I can call on you when it's time. Anyone else want to try this? Daniel, I mean, it came to mind when you were speaking. Is this intentional? Is this just a matter of, the cropping that's done or the focusing that's done? How does it work for your work?
Yeah, so this came up a lot as I was thinking about my research. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and at no point in my entire education, including college, do I recall anyone ever showing me a map of the United States that had Puerto Rico on it. And there used to be such maps. The United States used to produce such maps, and then, I mean, it sounds like erasure. The territories were pushed off the margins. But I couldn't find any sort of backroom conspiracy in the way that Professor Roper has described, an attempt to sort of push off, one history in favor of another. So that doesn't mean there's no intent, but it's not intent in the kind of conspiratorial way that you might imagine. I rather think of it as a sort of cultural direction informed by a certain sense of identity of what the United States is, and then a certain set of racial assumptions about that, which are worth contesting. But nevertheless, I couldn't find the memo where anyone said, let's make sure that, the maps of the United States don't have Guam on them. And I think that's kind of how hegemonic concepts often work. is that they don't require the conspiracy. It runs deeper than that, and that's why the received geographies, or the received histories in general that we have, can be so hard to unthink, because so much, not just a few members of the elite class have tried to sort of purvey them, but so many of us have for so long been thinking with these categories. And Professor Matthews' presentation about just sort of how the Maya just sort of don't fit in most people's historical conception, and therefore, are really hard to clock, seems an evocative example of that. So I don't think it needs to be intentional in the sense that we sometimes imagine. And I think sometimes the ones that aren't intended in that personal way can often be even harder to contend with.
May I come in on this?
Yes, I want all of you, please do.
Just quickly, it's for my perspective, the issue is I don't know if it's central, but people have different narratives or stories that they want to tell, and they fight over the space. And some people win in those battles, and some don't. I could do it with other memorial sites. I picked on this one just because it has an ironic dimension to it. You think it's a Holocaust memorial, and it is. That's what it's become, but it began as something else. And there was a struggle involved in that. We may not see signs of it now, but people wanted to reclaim Auschwitz for the Jews who were murdered there, in far greater number than Raisy Stone were. And the feeling was this memory has been confiscated by the communists, and so we needed to reclaim it for ourselves. So it's a conscious operation, and in that sense, it's an intentional operation that involves political power and who has it, and when they have it, at what particular moment, and over what corners of the world they have it. So,
well, I mean, as you said when you started out, this is not what people would typically think of as an erasure. This is a correction.
No, actually, it's a writing over. Is the way that's the image that I went with. I think, yes, for some people it's viewed as a correction, but the correction works in such a way that you don't actually see what was there before anymore. There's a little teeny bit of it in the Résistants and Patriotes who are referenced in the bottom of the plaque. I shouldn't talk too much. But you could easily not see it, and that history, in that sense, maybe it's erased or it's forgotten, and also who is there to speak up? I mean, not that I want to do that necessarily, but for the communist version of events of the World War II deportation. So I don't necessarily see it as a writing, there's another story, and I'm going to tell that one. And I've got the muscle to do it at this stage.
Laura?
Yeah, I actually want to circle back though, Philip, because that was a question that I had for you. Is what's happening, and you alluded to this a little bit. You teased us a bit, but you didn't tell us what was on some of the cards of the flowers. But you did show us, for instance, the hanging of the Spanish Republican flag. Is it rewriting that is, as Annette says, a kind of rewriting over? Or is it multiple understandings and narratives that are either contesting or coexisting?
Actually, I think that's a sounder version of what I'm saying. So that, yes, the memorials are there. There are people who do remember what these memorials were when they were first created, and come to pay their respects to that memory. And so it'll be, the local branch of the PCF, the French Communist Party, or Vietnamese dignitaries who are visiting, or PRC officials, People's Republic of China officials, so they know. But the average visitor, and if you were to Google it, as I have, and go to look up Père-Lachaise, they would tell you this is all about the Holocaust. So both memories are there simultaneously. And yet one has the upper hand, in a manner of speaking. So that's the way I would, maybe that's a good refinement for what I would say.
And I guess I would just to add my own little piece. Yeah, I think hegemonic ideas, that it's the unintentionality in my case that I think yeah, that the invisibility is just so persistent, and the only seeing the episodes but never, not even necessarily having an interest or an awareness. I taught a class where I tried to talk about the entangled histories of Mexico, the United States, and Central America, and take it from, and I had students do research on someplace in sort of greater Mesoamerica. So I allowed Mesoamerica's geographical frame to go up, and they went, you know, so like, where does it stop and where are the different parts of arid America? And they were going all the way up into Oregon. And by the end, we'd gone through sort of the development of racist ideas and ideas of race in the early modern period. And then the distinctions between Mexico's relationship with the United States versus Central America's. And then we ended up in El Salvador. And by the end, they really, I remember a student looked at me, he's like, I have no idea why we started with Native America. I was like, oh, you know, I lost them. It was too complex. But I think there's an emotional aspect too with hegemonic ideas, and in the United States, for, you know, obviously that debate over so many of the different distinct parts of our history as an increasingly powerful actor in the world, militarily and economically, and in so many other ways. There's this. I don't find students necessarily resistant to, they're able to have very critical and complex conversations about that. But I don't think as a society and as a culture, and I suspect we're not unique in this, it's a challenging thing to do, and I don't think we do it very well.
Well, I'm going to ask a question that shows my ignorance about Maya. Do people, do they identify as Guatemalans? I would, has the national identity taken over the notion of a historical people, the Maya?
Generally their intention, I would say, and this would be true. This is why it was so interesting and important to me that people recognize how much there's been changes in Mexican migration to the United States in the past 30, 40, 50 years as well. So if you go to LA or wherever, you'll find many more people from Oaxaca who are also indigenous. They might be Mije or Mixtec or Zapotec, or in the Yucatan in Mexico is a famously very resistant to being absorbed by the Mexican state, not just the Spanish colonial state, but the Mexican state, which they also viewed as a kind of colonialism. The Mexican nation has been much more successful, I would say, you know, when we talk about their own kinds of erasure or appropriation of the Native American amongst them. In Mexico, it's, of course, it's a little what you were saying, Shani, that idea of assimilation and the idea of the hybridity and everybody coming together into one people, whereas I would say in Guatemala, it has been more repressive. It's more of a, and more complicated, even though both states use indigenous people as tourist attractions. You know, obviously in Guatemala, there was a pretty brutal repression. So
yeah. Let's go to some questions. Adam Benayad, I hope I'm pronouncing that the right way. He's a graduate student at Southern New Hampshire University studying American history. He says, with the growing pressure towards removing historical figures, statues, and renaming military bases within the United States, how has the historical community responded to these actions? Is this something taken with open arms or scrutinized? What can we do as historians to prevent history from being erased? Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, to empirically answer the question, my sense is that historians have generally been quite sympathetic to a lot of attempts to rename things that were named after Confederate officers and war heroes. And I think beyond that, I would want to make a distinction between our function is preserving a memory of the past and preserving all the ways in which the past is sort of inscribed on our landscape. We live here, we're allowed to move the furniture around. And when we change a monument or change a name, I mean, that's actually an extraordinary historical act that reflects our values that is really important. So I mean, not even just things that I sort of politically find gross that I'd like to see renamed. I like the idea of us renaming things a lot, because in doing so, we are articulating our historical moment, what it's about, and the history of how things have been moved, how things have been renamed, is a really important and interesting way to understand who we are. So I like how we reflect on our history by, you know, scrutinizing the things around us and thinking, is this who we are? Does this represent us? So, and I think there are all kinds of ways for us to be historians who care about the past, who care about political engagement in the past, but don't see that having to take the form of, you know, don't touch any of the furniture.
I'm happy to come in if that's all right.
That's fine.
Just with two quick thoughts. So I work on France, lived in an apartment in a neighborhood. It had a street named after Alexis Carrel, not a name that any of you will remember, but he ran basically a racist foundation under the Vichy regime during World War II in France, and the name was changed. I see no difficulty whatsoever in altering name places and the names of things. What I try to suggest about the monuments is that they are not just things, but they tell a story and they're part of a narrative. And you can do a couple things with that. You can make that explicit, because sometimes the narrative is hidden or obscured or told in rosy colored terms. And what historians can do is to say, this is what the narrative is. And we can either relocate monuments in order to make plain just what the nature of that narrative is. It may be obscure, hidden, buried, implicit, and to make it explicit through the gathering of things, or you can make it explicit by adding additional text if that's what you so desire. But I mean, I can't help but thinking the first time I visited UNC and to see Silent Sam on the lawn there and scratching my head and thinking, what is this doing here? What does this mean? And trying to say, well, the common soldier, yes, I guess everybody makes sacrifices, even in a bad cause. I can understand that. But in the course of what's happened in the last 12 months, it's quite clear that this is part of a particular culture of redemption. And that needs, whether you want to destroy the statue or not, that's what needs to be made explicit and what historians can do. And it's, I would even say should do in order to make that, make that plain. And there are lots of ways of doing it, through relocation, through renaming. I'm disinclined to go the destruction route. That's my personal orientation. But otherwise, that's what's happening all the time. And why should we not participate in it if it's something that's continuous and ongoing? And that was in part the subject of my talk, is the way in which something has been reappropriated and redesigned and given a new meaning in the process.
Okay. Shall I go to another question? Rebecca Michelson has a question in regards to Philip Nord's and Shani Roper's discussion of historical memory and memorization. Do you think the pressure to write over the history of communist activism in battling fascism to a more traditional Holocaust memorial, and for Dr. Roper, the pressure to erase Black radicalism was internal within France or Jamaica, or external within the nations? I'm thinking of the US-driven narrative. In other words, were they influenced by outsiders in any way to do this? Or is this internal?
Just quickly, it would be internal, but the internal is a manifestation of a wider phenomenon, which is something that happens across the North American and West European world at this particular moment in the 1980s and 1990s, and that is it's a world in which communism and Marxism are in retreat, and the stories that they told are weakening as a consequence, which creates space for other stories to be written over them. So that's a.
I would say that it's similarly internal, but the internal again is a reaction to what is perceived as, what does it mean to be an independent nation in the 1960s, and given and other islands in the region are actually having similar discourses. The current the Black Lives Matter movement, they remove all of the Colson statue in Britain. All of those debates have actually had triggers in the Caribbean around long-term conversations around the remaining colonial monuments and the relationship of having these spaces or putting them or pulling them down or relocating them. So for example, the Lord Nelson statue in Barbados was relocated. But I do think that there's a kind of emotional tie-in, there's a psycho-emotional tie-in around the symbols of monuments and how they can disrupt and alienate people within a landscape. So I think even though there is an effort of renaming or relocating, that must also happen with something else, right? So in a lot of ways, it's not enough to relocate and remove, but there has to be a kind of public education around the renegotiation of a monument, right? So when those debates were happening globally and the debates started to pick up in the Caribbean, we had a series of 2 programs around monuments in the Caribbean to kind of have a kind of culture, a kind of location around it, and then to have a kind of public education. So there is what the artist does in terms of interpretation. So a lot of the Civil War monuments are of course daughters of the Confederacy. But in the Caribbean, the relationship between colonial monuments and the British monarchy and the ways in which we view ourselves as colonial citizens transitioning into national citizens, that those discussions also have to be had. So in a lot of ways you can rename, but the actual trauma around those who are alienated as opposed to those who are comfortable is not kind of negotiated. Sometimes that's not even enough.
That's not enough, yeah. Let's take one last question. Claire Mayo, who says, to what extent does a historian's own subjectivity determine erasures, intentional or not, in the process of writing history? I'm thinking of Mark Bloch's argument in The Historian's Craft for this subjectivity. At the same time, how can or should a historian cultivate an awareness to combat the hegemonic systems in place that have produced the erasures? That's a tough question there, just a little bit here. Anybody have an answer for this? Want to take this on? Subjectivity, how much is it the historian's own subjectivity that determines the erasures?
I can make a little bit of a stab at this. That's a really wonderful and complex question.
End on, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, of course, right? None of us can escape our own subjectivity. For me as an historian, it's so trite to say, but of course, the older we get, the more we find out we're completely ignorant, and our ignorance just has grown, vaster and vaster and vaster. I love it. I love it when I suddenly realized that I was all wrong. and I had no idea that something that was right in front of me existed, sort of like what I was, alleging happens. I happen to see the Maya because I've spent a lot of time in Guatemala, but there are so many things I don't see. I mean, I think as an historian, that's often just the most wonderful thing. This is why we do this, right? Because it just, it makes things even more complex, and we kind of get off on that. Yeah.
Anyone else?
All right. I'll just say a word about subjectivity. First of all, it's a moving target. You see things other people don't see sometimes, and then they come along and show you something that you didn't see. And as Laura put it, it's in plain sight. It was there in front of you all the time. And for whatever reason, your lens, and I don't necessarily think one person is more inclined to be guilty of this than another. We have our blind spots. What historians can do is to reveal them and show you another way of looking at things. And whether that subverts the hegemonic, at least in the area I work in, well, I guess I am saying the Holocaust Memorial has become, even that though, it's not true because it's in motion and it's changing. It has a moment of hegemony, just as Gaullist memory has a moment of hegemony in the 1960s, but it erodes very, very quickly with the passage of time, and other narratives and other stories surge in and get entangled and make things complex. So do I have a special responsibility to take the pickaxe to hegemonic? Maybe I do, maybe I don't, but it won't last, that hegemony, for very long. It's going to be undone if not by me, then by somebody else.
So speaking from a museum curatorial perspective, I think whenever we conceptualize something, we actually make choices about what we choose to put out there. But the other side of it is, if we are truly committed to a kind of shared engagement of the museum space and the curatorial space, then it requires a little transparency as well about what you don't say in the exhibition. And I think that is a little different from writing a book where you may be very intentional about, this is what I'm going to focus on, and you've gathered all your evidence and listed why this is important to the counter arguments that exist. But in a museum space, there's a little bit more flexibility, almost like in a classroom, to say, well, we didn't include these things. Do you think it would alter what you see here or not? And I think that that you acknowledge your subjectivity, but you also open the floor for greater discussions about what's at the table.
Any thoughts, Dan? Daniel, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. We always worry about what we're not seeing, and I'll just say that as scholars, we have sometimes an enormous luxury, which is a little bit of time to think twice about the things that most people don't have a first thought about. And I think that part of that joy is this sort of kind of contemplative act of considering things from many perspectives and clawing your way towards some new vantage in doing that. That we're gifted with at least some of the resources to do, and I hope we can take advantage of those.
Well, this has been a great discussion and lots of fun, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for participating in this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And this is one of the great things about Zoom. We can sort of get these things together with people from vastly different parts of the country without having to move very far. Jim, good to see you again.
And it's good to see all of you. This concludes our presentation. I want to thank all of our presenters for a stimulating evening. A recording of this webinar will be available on the AHA's YouTube channel soon. Soon is a social construct, as historians put it, and so I'm not going to define it. But we will do as quickly as we can. You can view recordings already, not soon, of other past virtual AHA events on our YouTube channel as well. Don't miss our second plenary on the international implications of the United States election tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern. I have been privileged to have been part of email conversations among the panelists today and can guarantee you that it will be an interesting and stimulating conversation. Thanks again to our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and the Oxford University Press. Thank you to all of you who have submitted questions. We apologize for not getting to every question during the limited time that we had. And finally, again, a special thanks to our panelists. I wish everybody a good evening for what's left of it. Good night.
Good night.